How far would you go to make someone pay for a loss? Sometimes the real cost isn't what's taken, but what you lose in the process. In the heart of a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled among neatly trimmed hedges and well-maintained lawns, sat a cozy, modest house that belonged to Mrs. Brown. She was a woman in her late 50s, living alone after her husband passed away several years ago. The house had been passed down to her from her parents, and while it wasn't large or extravagant, Mrs. Brown found comfort in it. She had a small garden, which she tended to with loving care, but the centerpiece of her yard, the thing that filled her with the most pride, was an ancient red apple tree. The tree had been there long before Mrs. Brown moved in, planted by the original owner of the house, and even then, it had been a thing of beauty. Over the years, the tree had grown strong and sturdy, its branches stretching high and wide, laden with the juiciest, most fragrant apples you could ever imagine. Every year, the tree showered her yard with its bountiful fruit, and Mrs. Brown reveled in the abundance. She would sit in her garden, basking in the shade of its thick branches, and often dream of the sweet pies and tarts she could bake with the apples. But Mrs. Brown never got around to it. She was getting older, and while she loved the idea of baking, the reality was that she couldn't quite keep up with the work anymore. And that's where Maxwell James came into the story. Maxwell lived next door to Mrs. Brown. He was in his early 30s, a tall, athletic man with a boyish charm and a strong sense of pride in his neighborhood. Maxwell was a fitness coach, and though he wasn't home all the time, his job took him all over the city. He always made sure to maintain his property and keep things neat. He had grown up in the neighborhood and had bought his house when he was just starting out in his career. Like most of the people who lived on the street, Maxwell was a creature of routine. He enjoyed the peaceful, calm life that suburban living offered, and in many ways, it suited him perfectly. But there was something that caught Maxwell's eye every year: the apple tree in Mrs. Brown's yard. The branches of the tree grew so large that they hung over the fence, dangling just above Maxwell's property. In the early fall, when the apples started to ripen, they would fall from the tree and land in his yard, creating a small, colorful carpet of red and green beneath the branches. At first, Maxwell simply admired the tree from a distance. He enjoyed the sight of it, the way it stood tall and proud in the middle of Mrs. Brown's garden, the apples turning red and golden under the sun. One day, while he was out in his yard, Maxwell spotted a perfectly ripe apple that had fallen onto his side of the fence. It was too beautiful to ignore, its skin glistening in the afternoon sunlight. Without thinking twice, Maxwell bent down, picked up the apple, and took a bite. The sweetness exploded in his mouth, and he felt a rush of satisfaction. It was like no apple he'd ever tasted before, perfectly balanced, juicy, and just the right amount of tartness. Over the next few weeks, Maxwell kept an eye on the tree. He began to pick apples whenever they fell into his yard, and before long, his kitchen was filled with them. Inspired by the bounty, he started baking. Apple pies, apple tarts, apple crumbles. He made them all. And every year, like clockwork, he would bring a fresh batch over to Mrs. Brown's house as a gesture of goodwill. It became a tradition. Maxwell would knock on Mrs. Brown's door, offering her a warm apple pie or a jar of homemade applesauce, and she would always welcome him with open arms. Mrs. Brown, for her part, never seemed to mind. In fact, she always expressed her gratitude with a smile and a compliment. "Maxwell, these pies of yours are the best I've ever had. You've got a real gift in the kitchen," she'd say, her eyes sparkling with appreciation. Over time, the small acts of kindness between the two grew into an unspoken bond. Maxwell had been a young boy when Mrs. Brown had first moved in, and he'd always admired her warmth and quiet strength. Now, as an adult, he appreciated the friendship they had built, but more than that, he genuinely enjoyed giving her the fruits of the apple tree. It felt like a way to repay her for all the years she'd lived there, a way to show her that her generosity, however unintentional, hadn't gone unnoticed. But as much as Maxwell enjoyed picking the apples and baking them into delightful treats, he couldn't help but wonder if Mrs. Brown had ever really noticed just how much he'd been taking. Sure, she appreciated the pies, but did she realize how often he collected the apples? Did she ever think about the tree's branches hanging over the fence? Maxwell began to wonder if Mrs. Brown had grown complacent about it all. Perhaps she didn't mind that her tree was spilling over into his yard, or maybe she simply didn't care anymore. Either way, the apples kept coming, year after year. And so did the pies. For a long time, neither of them questioned the arrangement. It had become routine, almost like a game that no one spoke about aloud. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Maxwell had begun to feel a sense of entitlement. After all, it was his yard the apples were falling into, and he was the one doing all the work to make delicious dishes out of them. Shouldn't Mrs. Brown have been a little more considerate, maybe even asked him if he wanted to keep picking apples? But Maxwell, ever the optimist, continued bringing the pies and enjoying the benefits of the tree, unaware that the small, seemingly innocent actions of his past were slowly but surely leading towards something neither of them could have predicted. It was on a crisp autumn morning that Maxwell James, despite his busy lifestyle, decided to take a step he had been thinking about for a while: adopting a dog. As a fitness coach, he'd always admired the loyalty and companionship that dogs offered, and he thought it was time to have one of his own. After careful consideration, he chose a small, purebred pup, an expensive, well-bred animal that he named Bella. She was a ball of energy, a golden retriever with a shiny coat and an infectious wag to her tail. From the moment she came into his life, Bella became his shadow, always by his side, whether he was working out, walking around the neighborhood, or simply relaxing at home. Bella's presence brought Maxwell a kind of joy and peace that he hadn't realized he was missing. However, after a month of joyfully bonding with his new pet, Maxwell noticed something was terribly wrong. Bella, usually full of life, began to cough and wheeze, her breathing becoming shallow and labored. At first, he thought it was just a cold, something that would pass with time. But as the days went on, Bella's condition worsened. Her once boundless energy drained, and she started to look weak and tired. Alarmed, Maxwell rushed her to the emergency animal clinic late one night. The vet tried everything, but Bella's condition continued to deteriorate. After what seemed like hours of futile attempts to stabilize her, Bella passed away in Maxwell's arms. The vet, after conducting an autopsy, gave Maxwell the devastating news. Bella's death was caused by something lodged in her throat. A small object had blocked her airway. An apple seed. It had choked her, and there was nothing that could be done to save her. The seed, the vet explained, had come from one of the apples that had fallen from the tree next door. Maxwell was crushed, devastated by the sudden loss of his furry friend. His grief quickly turned to anger, and his mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had happened. How could something so trivial, so innocent, cause Bella's untimely death? As he pieced the events together, one thought kept gnawing at him: Mrs. Brown's tree. For years, the apples from her red apple tree had fallen into his yard. Maxwell had picked them up, turning them into delicious pies and tarts. He'd enjoyed the fruits of that tree, unknowingly sharing in its bounty. But now, with the tragic death of Bella, Maxwell couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Brown was to blame. After all, the apple that had caused Bella's death had come from her tree. If Mrs. Brown had cared enough to trim those branches, maybe this wouldn't have happened. If she had taken responsibility for the tree, none of this would have occurred. Maxwell's mind began to cloud with a mix of sadness and frustration. His heart ached for Bella, but his anger was now directed at the one person he believed was responsible: Mrs. Brown. He couldn't let her get away with this, not after everything he had gone through. In his grief, he felt a sense of betrayal. She had been so kind, so generous with her apples, but now, all he could see was her negligence. It was unforgivable. That afternoon, Maxwell marched over to Mrs. Brown's house. His steps were heavy, his fists clenched. Mrs. Brown was sitting on her porch when Maxwell arrived, the usual warmth in her expression replaced by confusion as she saw his angry face. "What's going on, Maxwell?" Mrs. Brown asked, standing up to greet him. She could tell something was wrong. Maxwell didn't waste any time. "Your tree killed my dog, Mrs. Brown," he blurted out, the words coming out harsh and raw. "Bella ate one of your apples. You've let those branches hang over the fence for years, and now my dog is dead because of it. You should have trimmed those branches. You should have done something." Mrs. Brown's face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. "What are you talking about?" She stumbled over her words, her mind struggling to process the accusation. "Maxwell, I've always let you take the apples. You've never complained. I've never thought anything bad would happen. The branches have been hanging over for years, and I never saw the harm in it. You've always taken them. You've always enjoyed them." Maxwell wasn't listening anymore. "You should have cut the tree back, Mrs. Brown. You knew it was dangerous, and you didn't do anything about it. Now my dog is dead because of you." Mrs. Brown, shocked by the intensity of his words, opened her mouth to speak, but Maxwell interrupted her, his voice rising. "I'm not leaving until you take responsibility. I want you to pay for the vet bills. I want you to pay for Bella. And I want you to pay for her burial costs. You owe me that, Mrs. Brown. If you had done the right thing and cut those branches back, she'd still be here." Mrs. Brown stood there, stunned. Her hands trembled at her sides as she struggled to find the right words. This wasn't how she had expected the conversation to go. This wasn't the neighborly relationship they'd always had. She had always thought of Maxwell as a friend. How had things gone so wrong? She took a step back, trying to steady herself. "Maxwell, I never wanted this to happen. I didn't know. I didn't think." But Maxwell was already shaking his head, his anger and grief blinding him to any kind of understanding. "It's too late for apologies," he muttered. "It's too late." Without waiting for her response, he turned and stormed off the porch, leaving Mrs. Brown standing there, speechless, her heart sinking with the weight of the accusations. As Maxwell walked back to his house, he couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Brown hadn't done enough to prevent the tragedy. He was lost in his rage, not seeing the full picture of the situation, the years of kindness, and the unspoken bond that had once existed between them. And as for Mrs. Brown, she stood at her doorstep, torn between disbelief and sorrow. She never imagined that something so tragic, so painful, would come from her beloved tree. What had once been a simple exchange of kindness had now been shattered. The tension between Maxwell James and Mrs. Brown had reached a boiling point. What started as a small disagreement over a tree had now spiraled into a full-blown legal battle, and both neighbors found themselves standing in front of a judge in small claims court. Maxwell sat in the courtroom, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his jaw set in a hard line. The anger he had felt over Bella's death had only intensified in the days leading up to the court hearing. He was determined to hold Mrs. Brown accountable, convinced that her negligence had caused his dog's tragic demise. When the judge called for the hearing to begin, Maxwell rose to his feet and took the stand. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he recounted the events that led to Bella's death. He explained how his beloved dog had been playing in the yard one afternoon when she picked up an apple from the ground, a gift, as he saw it, from Mrs. Brown's tree. He spoke of how Bella had suffered, the way she struggled to breathe as the apple seed lodged in her throat. The vet's report confirmed the cause of death: the apple seed. With each word, Maxwell's anger grew. "If Mrs. Brown had done something about those branches," he said, his voice rising, "if she had taken responsibility, my dog would still be alive. The apples fell right into my yard, and I had no choice but to let Bella eat them. She was just a dog. She didn't know any better. But Mrs. Brown knew. She knew the branches were overhanging, and she did nothing." Maxwell leaned forward, his gaze piercing the judge. She let it happen, Your Honor. Her tree killed my dog. She should pay for it. The judge, an older man with a calm demeanor, listened attentively. He made a note on his pad but said nothing, giving Maxwell the space to finish his testimony. When Maxwell finally sat down, the judge nodded and turned his attention to Mrs. Brown, who had been quietly waiting for her turn. She stood up, her hands slightly trembling, but her voice was clear and composed as she approached the stand. Mrs. Brown was in her late 50s, a woman whose life had been rooted in the simple joys of gardening and tending to her beloved apple tree. But now, this tree, this symbol of tranquility, had become the epicenter of her troubles. "I've known Maxwell for years," she began, her voice soft but firm. "I've always tried to be a good neighbor to him. And for the last 10 years, I shared my apples with him." She paused, glancing briefly at Maxwell. "Every year, I made sure to give him fresh apples, and I enjoyed the desserts he brought to me in return. We had an understanding. We both enjoyed the fruit from that tree." She sighed, her expression pained. "Not once in all these years did Maxwell ever ask me to trim the branches. Not once did he ever mention any danger or express concern about them. In fact, he took the apples, year after year, and never complained. He even trimmed the branches on his side, himself, when they grew too long. I never thought anything could go wrong. I never imagined that something so small could cause so much pain." Mrs. Brown's voice faltered for a moment, but she continued, her tone tinged with sadness. "I thought he was happy with the apples. I thought I was doing something kind by sharing them. He never mentioned any danger. I only trimmed the branches on my side every year, because I didn't want to take away the joy he seemed to get from those apples. I didn't want to make him feel like I was taking something away from him." She looked toward the judge, her eyes brimming with sincerity. "I didn't know, Your Honor. I didn't know that the apples were dangerous. If I had known, I would have acted. But I thought it was just a tree, just fruit. I never thought it would cause this kind of tragedy." As Mrs. Brown finished her statement, the courtroom was quiet, the air thick with emotion. Maxwell stared at her, but his anger had softened just slightly. He could see the hurt in her eyes, the genuine sorrow. But still, the pain of losing Bella weighed heavily on his heart. He wanted someone to be accountable. He wanted justice. The judge leaned back in his chair, deep in thought. He considered the case carefully, the facts laid out before him, and the testimony he had heard from both sides. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke. "It's clear to me that both parties here had an understanding, a mutual relationship built over many years. Maxwell has enjoyed the apples for a long time, and Mrs. Brown has shared them willingly. The question, however, is whether Mrs. Brown had a responsibility to trim the branches to prevent this tragedy." The judge looked down at his notes before continuing. "Maxwell, you've admitted that you knew the apples from the tree have fallen into your yard. You never mentioned any concerns about the branches until after the tragedy occurred. You've also taken the apples for years without raising the issue of danger. You even trimmed the branches on your side when necessary." Turning to Mrs. Brown, the judge said, "And Mrs. Brown, while I understand your intentions were good, you did not take proactive measures to prevent the branches from overhanging into Maxwell's yard. You did not know, as you said, that the apples could pose a danger, but you also never discussed this possibility with your neighbor." He paused before delivering his verdict. "Based on the evidence presented, I cannot hold Mrs. Brown responsible for the death of Maxwell's dog. Maxwell, you have enjoyed the fruit of that tree for years without complaint, and Mrs. Brown has done nothing but share her bounty with you. The tragedy, while heartbreaking, is a result of circumstances beyond her control." Maxwell's face fell as the judge continued. "You will be responsible for the court fees, Maxwell, as the case was not ruled in your favor." Maxwell's heart pounded with frustration, and he felt a lump in his throat. The finality of the decision hit him hard. He had wanted justice, but in his grief, He had failed to see the full picture. As he left the courtroom, Mrs. Brown's words echoed in his mind. I thought I was doing something kind by sharing them. He had been consumed by anger, but now, as he walked out into the daylight, a deep sense of regret began to settle within him. Had he been too quick to blame? Had he misunderstood the true nature of his neighbor's intentions? The guilt weighed on him, and he couldn't help but feel that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't Mrs. Brown who had failed Bella. It was fate. As Maxwell walked out of the courtroom, defeated but still burning with anger, a strange feeling began to settle in his chest. The weight of the judge's ruling, coupled with the bitter taste of his loss, seemed to haunt him. He had hoped for justice, an acknowledgement of his grief and anger over Bella's untimely death. But instead, all he was left with was the realization that maybe his emotions had clouded his judgment. But little did he know, the story was far from over. The courthouse doors had barely closed behind him when Mrs. Brown, standing just outside the building, pulled out her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed the number. Yes, this is Mrs. Brown from Brick Street. I need to report an incident, she said, her voice low but resolute. It's about my apple tree. I believe my neighbor, Maxwell James, has damaged it, intentionally. Her heart was pounding with a strange mix of triumph and bitterness. Maxwell may have lost the case, but in her mind, he had taken something much more precious from her. Her peace of mind, her dignity. The police responded quickly, and before Maxwell knew what was happening, the officers were at his door, knocking firmly. He had barely gotten into his car when they arrived, their flashing lights illuminating the street. His stomach twisted as he rolled down the window. Maxwell James, one of the officers asked, "We need you to come with us." He was taken aback. "What is this about? I haven't done anything wrong." "We have a report that you vandalized Mrs. Brown's apple tree," the officer said, his voice firm but not unfriendly. "We need to ask you a few questions." Maxwell's jaw dropped. "What? Vandalism? That's insane. I didn't touch her tree." The officers didn't seem convinced, and before Maxwell could protest further, they led him to their patrol car. Mrs. Brown, standing by her window, watched from a distance. There was a small, satisfied smile on her lips, though it was tinged with something darker. As Maxwell was driven away, she whispered to herself, "Sometimes, the truth comes out when you least expect it." Back at the police station, Maxwell was interrogated. The officers explained that they had found evidence of a saw mark on one of Mrs. Brown's major tree branches. It was clear that someone had intentionally cut through it. The mark was fresh, and although there were no witnesses, the timing seemed to suggest that it had happened not long before Mrs. Brown called them. Maxwell's mind was spinning. "This is ridiculous. I haven't touched that tree," he insisted. "I just wanted to forget the whole thing and move on with my life." The officers, however, were unmoved. They pointed out that, given the ongoing tension between the two neighbors, it was hard to ignore the possibility that Maxwell had acted out of frustration after losing the court case. "Are you sure you didn't cut that tree?" one officer asked. "Because if you did, it's a criminal act. We can't just ignore it." Maxwell's hands were shaking as he tried to explain. "I swear, I didn't do anything. I just wanted to put all this behind me. I didn't touch her tree. I didn't hurt anyone." But despite his protests, the evidence against him seemed too strong to ignore. The police couldn't ignore the saw marks on the branch, and although Maxwell insisted it was all a mistake, the case seemed too neatly tied up to be dismissed easily. Hours passed, and Maxwell's frustration grew. How could this be happening? He had been the victim, right? He had lost his dog, his sense of peace, his dignity. Why was he the one being punished now? He couldn't comprehend it. It was as though the universe had turned against him. Meanwhile, Mrs. Brown continued to watch from her window, feeling a strange sense of vindication. She wasn't a woman known for seeking revenge, but this This felt like justice, perhaps not in the way she had expected, but in her mind, Maxwell's anger and rash actions were finally catching up to him. As the officers finished their investigation, the truth came to light. Maxwell had, in fact, been the one to damage the apple tree. But it wasn't as sinister as Mrs. Brown had hoped. The investigation revealed that Maxwell, in a fit of anger, had tried to cut off the overhanging branches himself, believing it would somehow make up for his loss. He had no intention of harming the tree permanently. He simply wanted to send a message to Mrs. Brown, one that he never managed to communicate properly. The damage wasn't extensive, but it was enough to qualify as vandalism. Maxwell was arrested, but his charges were not as severe as he had feared. It was only a minor charge of property damage, but it was a blow to his reputation, and his guilt over Bella's death weighed even more heavily on him now. He realized, too late, that his rage had caused more harm than he could have imagined, not only to Mrs. Brown's tree, but to his own soul. As Maxwell was released on bail, he walked out of the station, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. The guilt, the anger, the grief, all of it crushed him. He had no idea what had gone wrong, but now, in the quiet aftermath of the courtroom drama, it felt like everything had fallen apart. Meanwhile, back at Mrs. Brown's house, she felt a flicker of peace wash over her. Despite the emotional toll, she had finally defended herself. She had stood up for what was right. But as she gazed at her apple tree from her window, still standing strong and full of fruit, she couldn't shake the sense that she, too, had lost something. Perhaps not a beloved pet, but something just as precious: her trust in her neighbor, her peace of mind. The story had ended, but the scars of this feud would linger far longer than either Maxwell or Mrs. Brown could ever have imagined. In the end, both of them had been victims of their own emotions, both driven by grief and anger to a place they never thought they'd go. And sometimes, that's where the true cost of a conflict lies, not in what's taken, but in what's lost along the way. Thanks so much for watching till the end. Kindly endeavor to like, subscribe, share to your friends, families, and community, and also let us know your perspective about this story. Do you have any tree laws in your country? And how do you handle this somewhat situation of trespassing and its related conflict? See you in the next tale.